Have you ever looked into the eyes of history's most terrifying figures and wondered what went wrong? Before they were tyrants, before they became symbols of fear and oppression, they were just children. Yet somewhere along the way, something twisted into something horrifying. Was it their upbringing? The harsh hands of cruel parents? The relentless pressures of a broken society? Or were they simply born different? Today we'll uncover the childhood stories of some of history's most feared madmen. And trust me, it's haunting to see how these children became monsters. Let's start with one of the most infamous names of all, Mao Zedong. His policies killed more people than World War I. Tens of millions starved, and anyone who dared speak against him was silenced. Yet before he ruled China, he was just a farm boy caught between a harsh father and a gentle, devout mother. Shaoshan, Hunan Province, a small rural village in southern China. In 1893, a boy named Mao Zedong was born into a harsh world where the weak were punished and the strong took power. Mao's father was a tough, profit-driven farmer who believed obedience was the law. When Mao disobeyed, punishment came fast. A heavy hand, a leather belt, and lessons carved into his skin. In that world, respect wasn't earned with love. It was forced with fear. His mother, however, was different. Soft-spoken and devout, she tried to protect him with gentle words and quiet prayers. Yet Mao saw that even her kindness could not stop his father's anger. The real change came when Mao was sent to a strict Confucian school. He hated it. The rigid rules and demand for blind respect felt just like his father's harsh rule. While his classmates learned about tradition and philosophy, Mao devoured books about war, power, and revolution. Then, a moment changed everything. China was falling apart. Famine spread and corruption was everywhere. The old dynasty was crumbling, and young Mao saw the suffering all around him. Foreigners controlled China's ports, warlords divided the land, and a new movement, communism, was rising. In the 1920s, Mao joined the Communist Party. He marched through villages, rallying an army of peasants by promising them land, food, and revenge against the powerful elites. When the government cracked down on communists, he led his forces on a grueling 6,000-mile retreat, known as the Long March. Thousands died along the way, but those who survived saw him as an unbreakable leader. Over the next decade, he crushed his rivals with the help of the Communist Party. By 1949, the Civil War ended. Mao's Red Army had taken control, the old government fell, and the People's Republic of China was born under his rule. Then the real suffering began. Mao launched the Great Leap Forward, a radical economic plan that caused the worst famine in history. At least 30 million people starved to death. Families were torn apart, villages were left empty, and anyone who complained simply disappeared. After that came the Cultural Revolution, a nationwide purge of anyone who questioned him. Intellectuals, teachers, and even loyal officials were humiliated, beaten, or killed. Millions more suffered as Mao tightened his grip on China. Mao's rough childhood had planted the seeds of what he would become, a leader who ruled through fear, a man who saw human lives as mere tools, and a ruler who would do anything to keep power. But Mao's story is just the beginning. Next, we step into the shadows of another infamous name, a dictator who was raised to believe he was a god, Kim Jong-un. North Korea is a land built on fear. Every street, every classroom, every home echoes the same name, Kim. It's a dynasty like no other, where absolute loyalty is demanded and enemies are eliminated in the most gruesome ways imaginable. And at the center of it all stands a man raised to be more than just human. Kim Jong-un was born into power. From the moment he could speak, he was told he was special. His father, Kim Jong-il, had grown up under the same belief that the Kim family wasn't just ruling North Korea, they were North Korea. To question them was to question existence itself. But Kim Jong-un's childhood was far from ordinary. While most North Korean children endured hardship and starvation, reciting endless propaganda in their cold, cramped homes, Kim lived in a world of luxury, private palaces, personal chefs, and every comfort designed to shield him from his people's suffering. Yet for all his privilege, He was imprisoned within his own gilded cage. From an early age, he was surrounded by guards, monitored every moment of the day. Tutors and advisors had one mission: to instill in him the belief that he was divine. Every lesson hammered in one truth: he wasn't merely a ruler. He was untouchable, supreme, almost godlike. For a brief moment, it seemed he might taste freedom. As a teenager, he was sent to Switzerland under a fake identity. There, among normal students at an elite private school, he experienced life outside the confines of North Korea. He fell in love with basketball, developed a taste for Western music and movies, and saw a world where people could speak their minds. But that taste of freedom didn't last. When he returned home, the walls closed in. No more basketball, no more Western movies, no more freedom. The boy who once roamed the streets of Switzerland unnoticed was now trapped in a golden cage, his connection to the outside world erased. To shape him into the next supreme leader, his father stripped away every shred of softness and independent thought, replacing them with isolation, control, and fear. Advisors surrounded him, yet trust was a luxury he never knew. Routine loyalty tests became the norm. He was given friends only to watch them disappear overnight. Servants trembled at his slightest word or glance. By the time he took control, Kim Jong-un had inherited more than a country. He had inherited a system built entirely on absolute power, a system he knew how to wield with deadly precision. His reign began with blood. He took power by getting rid of those close to him. One of the first victims was his uncle, Jang Song-tak, who had once been a trusted mentor. In a shocking public event, his uncle was dragged away and executed in front of the world. He sent a public message that declared his total authority. The boy raised in isolation had become a ruler molded by fear. He spent his youth watching people disappear, and now he was the one making them vanish. In his eyes, his people were not citizens, but subjects, mere pawns and worshippers. And those who dared defy him, they rarely lived long enough to regret it. Yet not all tyrants are born into power. Some come from humble beginnings, from ordinary homes. That brings us now to the boy who dreamed of being an artist, but became something far darker. Adolf Hitler. Austria, 1889. In a quiet town near the German border, a baby boy was born, fragile, wide-eyed, and seemingly ordinary. No one could have guessed that this child would grow up to drag the world into darkness. He would transform an entire nation into his personal war machine and commit acts of genocide on an unimaginable scale. The world would remember him as a dictator, a warmonger, a monster. But in his own mind, he saw himself differently. Hitler's early years were defined by fear. At home, his father, Alois, beats and humiliates him daily, crushing any sign of defiance. Every mistake was met with brutal punishment. And his mother, Clara, offered no real protection. She clung to her prayers over her 3 lost children, even as the violence unfolded. When young Adolf reached out for comfort, her whispered rosary provided little solace against the harsh blows. Even sleep was no escape. His hunchbacked aunt, Johanna, filled his nights with eerie warnings, telling him that if he ever sucked his thumb, the barber would come with shears to cut it off. That fear became a constant companion, but the real turning point came later. As a boy, Hitler was obsessed with art. He longed to paint, to create beauty, and to be admired. He dreamed of attending the prestigious Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna, convinced that his future lay in grand canvases and perfect brushstrokes. Then came the rejection. Twice he applied and twice he was turned away. Critics said his work lacked the necessary skill. In that crushing moment of failure, the boy who once wanted to create began to harbor a deep desire to destroy. In Vienna, he wandered alone, barely scraping by, selling cheap sketches to tourists while watching wealth and power pass him by. Invisible and ignored, his bitterness grew. When he later moved to Munich and fought in World War I, his anger hardened into something far more dangerous. He came to believe that Germany had not lost the war. It had been betrayed by corrupt politicians and traitors. After the war, lost and furious, he found a cause among extremist groups who fed his growing hatred. His words became weapons, and soon he emerged as more than just a soldier. He became a leader, drawing crowds with fiery speeches that turned ordinary people into loyal followers. By the 1920s, he led the Nazi Party, promising revival while building his movement on fear, scapegoating, and violence. In 1923, he led a failed coup known as the Beer Hall Putsch, an audacious attempt to overthrow the government. Arrested and sent to prison, his defeat only made him more dangerous. By 1933, Hitler had seized absolute power, turning Germany into his personal realm. His secret police, the Gestapo, silenced any opposition. Dissenters disappeared without a trace, and the media echoed only his words. Germany was no longer just a country, it had become his. Then he started a war that set the world on fire. His armies invaded nation after nation, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. But his greatest crime was the Holocaust. 6 million Jewish men, women, and children were murdered, taken from their homes, sent to camps, and killed in gas chambers. If the world had let him paint, would history have turned out differently? Hitler built his empire on hatred, but our next tyrant ruled through fear. He turned terror into a way of life, Joseph Stalin. No one was safe from Joseph Stalin. Not his rivals, not his allies, not even his closest friends. Millions perished in his labor camps, their screams swallowed by the frozen wastelands of Siberia. He ruled from the shadows like a puppet master of fear. Yet Stalin wasn't born a tyrant. He was forged in the fires of cruelty, betrayal, and pain. His story begins in Gori, Georgia, where a boy named Ioseb Jugashvili entered a world steeped in violence. His father, Bessarion, a shoemaker with a penchant for vodka, beat him relentlessly. At home, the echoes of his father's blows filled every corner. His mother, Ketevan, tried desperately to protect him, but the house itself became a prison, and Ioseb, its most frequent victim. At school, young Ioseb was an outcast, small, sickly, and relentlessly mocked by his peers. Yet even then, a fire burned in his eyes, a simmering rage fueled by humiliation and longing for revenge. He turned to the works of revolutionaries like Karl Marx and Lenin, devouring their ideas of a world where the weak could rise up and crush their oppressors. Hoping to steer him toward a different path, Ketevan sent him to a church school, dreaming he might become a priest. Instead, Ioseb saw hypocrisy and corruption in the clergy, and his resolve to upend the system only deepened. By his teenage years, the boy who once cowered under his father's blows had transformed into a fighter, a thinker, a revolutionary in the making. He even changed his name to Stalin, meaning man of steel, a symbol of the strength he craved. Stalin's transformation was not just a product of his environment, it was forged in blood. He wasn't content to merely speak of revolution, he was willing to kill for it. He stole, smuggled, and bled for the cause, earning a reputation for ruthlessness and cunning. When he joined Lenin and the Bolsheviks, it was clear that his ambition knew no bounds. After the collapse of the Russian Empire in 1917, the new Soviet Union became the stage for Stalin's ascent. Climbing the ranks, he crushed anyone who dared oppose him. When Lenin died in 1924, rivals emerged, doubting his capabilities. One by one, through lies, manipulation, and sheer brute force, Stalin eliminated them, until the entire Soviet Union was under his iron control. Then came the Great Purge, a campaign of terror that swept the nation. Political rivals, military officers, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens were arrested, tortured, and executed by the thousands. The gulags, brutal labor camps in the frozen wastes of Siberia, became symbols of his reign, where millions died and were consigned to unmarked graves. But his cruelty wasn't confined within Soviet borders. During the Holodomor, a forced famine in Ukraine, millions starved while vast stores of grain were hoarded away. Stalin's iron grip extended into Eastern Europe as well, turning half the continent into puppet states under Soviet control. By the end of World War II, the USSR had emerged as a global superpower, built, however, on the suffering of tens of millions. The scared, sickly boy from Gori had become a man whom history would come to fear, a leader demanding absolute loyalty. a ruler who sent millions to their deaths without a hint of remorse. He understood perhaps better than anyone that power belongs not to the strongest or the smartest, but to the one willing to do anything to keep it. But Stalin wasn't the last. Across the world, another tyrant was rising, from the unforgiving desert to cast his own dark shadow over the world, Muammar Gaddafi. Under the scorching Libyan sun, a barefoot boy roamed the desert, caring for his family's animals. No palace, no privilege, just endless dunes and a burning hunger for something greater. His name was Muammar Gaddafi. Born in 1942 near Sirte to a humble Bedouin family, Gaddafi's early life was a lesson in survival. His family lived in a simple tent, moving with the shifting sands, chasing water and food in the unforgiving desert. There were no golden spoons in his home, just the constant lesson that only the strong endure. But despite the hardships, young Gaddafi was filled with pride. His tribe, his people, his identity were everything to him. He grew up hearing stories of foreign invaders, of how Libya had suffered under Italian colonial rule. To him, the world was divided into two groups, oppressors and the oppressed, and he was determined never to belong to the latter. When he finally went to school, he felt like an outsider. City kids mocked his Bedouin accent, his rough clothes, and his modest background. Rather than break him, their scorn only fueled his resolve. Then came his turning point. A figure appeared in his life that changed everything. Gamal Abdel Nasser. Nasser was the president of Egypt, a fiery Arab nationalist who had defied the West and thrown out British forces. Gaddafi was captivated. He memorized Nasser's speeches, swore to one day follow in his footsteps. By his teenage years, his dreams transformed into a burning desire for revolution. He wanted to free Libya from foreign influence, overthrow the monarchy, and unite the Arab world. He was ready to do whatever it took. Gaddafi joined the military as his ladder to power. He trained hard and bided his time until the moment was right. At just 27, he led a bloodless coup, toppling Libya's king and declaring himself the nation's leader. The Bedouin boy from the desert was now in command of an oil-rich nation, and from that moment on, Libya became his playground. But power came at a dark cost. As his rule progressed, Gaddafi's leadership turned ruthless. He ruled with paranoia and an iron fist. He kidnapped his critics and murdered them. Libya transformed into a police state where fear was the norm. His paranoia knew no limits. Even his closest allies lived in fear of sudden execution. Gaddafi's notoriety wasn't confined to Libya's borders either. He funded terrorist attacks around the world, including the infamous bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 that claimed 270 innocent lives. Despite these brutal acts, Gaddafi remained convinced he was a liberator, a visionary reshaping the world. He built a cult of personality so strong that his Green Book, a collection of his own political theories, was treated like sacred scripture to his followers. He lavished himself with grand titles like Brotherly Leader and King of Kings. Yet, like all dictators, his reign would not last forever, because the very people he claimed to protect would one day rise against him. And speaking of ruthless leaders who mastered the art of fear and violence, that brings us to the final man on our list, Saddam Hussein. The streets of Tikrit were no place for the weak, a rough town where thieves, warlords, and fighters ruled with their fists. To his enemies, he was ruthless. To his people, he was terrifying. He ordered mass executions, gassed entire Kurdish villages, and crushed uprisings with brute force. His secret police made dissidents vanish without a trace, their bodies dumped in mass graves. He even used chemical weapons on his own citizens, killing thousands in a single day. Iraq had become his personal empire, built on fear, war, and blood. In the midst of this chaos, in 1937, Saddam Hussein was born. He started life as an ordinary child, a child abandoned by his father before he was even born, and unwanted by a mother overwhelmed by despair. Instead of a loving home, Saddam was sent to live with his uncle, a man whose beliefs would leave a lasting, dark impression. This uncle was no ordinary guardian. He was a fanatic, obsessed with violence, revenge, and power. He taught young Saddam that mercy was a weakness, that enemies must be crushed without hesitation. By his teenage years, those lessons had taken hold. Saddam dominated the school. He carried an iron bar to school, striking fear into teachers and classmates alike. He wasn't interested in making friends. He wanted obedience. But schoolyard terror was just the beginning. He craved real power. In Iraq, the only path to that power was politics. At just 20 years old, Saddam joined the Ba'ath Party, a rising movement that prized absolute control and brutal strength. And Saddam was a perfect fit. He wasn't simply a follower. He became the enforcer. When someone needed to be silenced, he was the one holding the gun. Then came a turning point in 1959. The Ba'ath Party hatched a plan to assassinate the Iraqi prime minister, and Saddam was chosen for the mission. But things went terribly wrong. Injured and forced to flee, he spent years on the run across the desert. During his time in exile in Egypt, his mind never left Iraq. He studied, observed, and waited. And when he returned, he was sharper, smarter, and far more dangerous. By 1979, Saddam had clawed his way to the very top. His first act as Iraq's leader sent shockwaves through the nation. In a cold, calculated display, he held a meeting with his own government. One by one, he read out names. Men were dragged away, kicking, screaming, pleading for mercy. And in one swift, merciless act, they were executed on the spot as traitors. Saddam watched it all, calm and unmoved, sealing his grip over Iraq. For the next 2 decades, Saddam ruled with an iron fist. Mass executions, chemical attacks, torture chambers. The terror was unrelenting. He waged wars that left cities in ruins. His face dominated posters, currency, and giant murals that loomed over terrified citizens. He had learned from his uncle that power belonged to those who never showed weakness, and Saddam never did, until the very end. In his final days, as his empire crumbled and enemies closed in, the mighty dictator became a fugitive, hiding in a desert hole. When his captors finally found him, he looked nothing like the man who had once commanded an entire nation. Saddam Hussein died as a prisoner, but the scars he left on Iraq will never fade. In the dark soil of childhood, what poisonous seeds were sown? These madmen weren't born purely evil. They were shaped by neglect and cruelty. Imagine a fragile seed left alone in a field of harsh winds, without care. It twists into a towering tree whose roots choke everything in its path. Could the echoes of a father's anger, a mother's quiet despair, and the hard lessons of a broken home be the very water that fed this vine of tyranny? Does this make us wonder, if they had grown up in a caring garden, could they have blossomed into kind people instead of monsters? Might a world filled with compassion and gentle guidance have changed their fate? Their stories stand as a somber mirror, reflecting not only the darkness in these leaders but also the shadows in our own society. Which leaves us with one last thought. If the past has shaped so many of history's worst figures, what kind of leaders is the world creating right now?